Okay, well, hello everyone, and as you heard, we just started the recording, so that we can share. I've had at least so far 4 requests. Will we be able, we can't join it, will it be recording? So that I know that beyond the people in this room and online, there is interest in Alessandra's presentation. I will be brief. So my name is Joe Nasser, for those who don't know me. And I will say just no more than 2 minutes to get things started, to give time for Alessandra and the panelists who are here today. So just to say that, so I met Alessandra, as Cecilia introduced, when she was visiting and working on her PhD. Toronto was just a side exploration for comparative purposes with food movement in Brussels, which was the focus of her dissertation. So after she finished and stayed in touch, I'm one of the editors of a book series on urban agriculture, part of published by Springer. And I encouraged her that there is potential to take this further and to also make it more balanced so that Toronto and Brussels become truly companion pieces, companion stories that speak to each other or contrast each other. And this is what happened. And to be honest, her book moved faster than I expected, and it's just amazing. It was a pleasure to supervise, I guess, or to shepherd that process, I should say. And this is the product right here. And so this is the 13th book in our book series. And before I forget, so it's an academic book at academic prices. However, because it's been presented at a couple of conferences recently and this event, so we have a discount that I will figure out how I can share with others afterwards. We have flyer for those in the room, so it is like 20% off. So instead of very expensive, it's only a little less expensive. But there's also ebook version and so on. So maybe I'll just leave it at that, except to say just a little bit about how we're going to run this this seminar or webinar or both. Essentially, it's in 3 relatively neat parts. The first part, Alessandra will, I'll turn the screen sharing back on in a minute. She'll do her presentation, a micro synthesis of a rich book, but then focus on the 3 Toronto cases that she focused on to illustrate. And then second part, we have a panel of 3 distinguished scholars, actors around who have long experience with the food movement of the city. In order, Rhonda Teitel-Payne, Debbie Fields, and Laurie Stolbrand. And then finally, we'll open it up to a Q&A to enable a complex hybrid a conversation. We're gonna stick to, if everyone is okay with it, with using chat for those online, and we'll hand out index cards just to be able to maximize the number of opportunities for questions and comments to be shared. And so I'll come back and moderate that part later. So I'll put it back on screen share.
Does the mic need to be moved? Did you get a comment in the chat? I think I saw
Alessandra, if you can stand very close to the microphone and
actually,
try to project. Yeah.
the mic is on the desk.
Okay.
Oh, the mic is on the desk. No one's paying any attention to it. Sorry, that table. Yeah, that's the mic.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks a lot for this lovely introduction. I have no words really to express how happy and privileged I am to be here in presence, to be here in Toronto, to present a bit, illustrate this book with you, and to share some dialogue with the people, the panelists here present, as well as everyone in presence and online. So really thank you for hosting me and for giving me this opportunity. So in my presentation, I will go through this point. So I will talk about the genesis of the book, so the conception, a bit of overview of the content and structure of the book. And I will talk about briefly about the theoretical framework on the hybrid governance, so this kind of concepts that I developed. And I will show then how hybrid governance applies to different initiatives of food movements in Toronto. And then some conclusions. So the genesis of the book is between Europe and North America, and especially between the context of Brussels and Toronto, where I was based for my research. And indeed, like the basic concept and material that form the basis of this book are already were conceived already in 2015, so to say, when my research started, and then in 2017 when I came as a visiting scholar here in Toronto, as Cecilia mentioned. So in my research, I was concerned on how, on the one hand, the food movement nowadays have relatively developed and proliferated, supported by a fertile international governance. Think about networks such as the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact that connects cities around the world developing urban food policies and strategies. And overall, there is an increased awareness about the role of food and food systems as part of an urban sustainability agenda. No? But on the other hand, there are still challenges that affect food movements in important ways. For instance, challenges related to scarce resources, access to resources, land, first of all, and other material resources to sustain food movements, which connect with challenges to ensure the sustainability of initiatives through time, as well as challenges of leadership, guaranteeing leadership, legitimacy, and support for movement initiatives. So, in a way, the overarching aim of my book, so to say, my research, is to show how the transformative aspiration of urban food movements, on the one hand, clash or are, verified once food movement encounter real-life challenges or tensions in implementing their transformative ambitions. So the structure of the book, briefly. So the book is divided into 7 chapters, and while chapter 1 gives an introduction to the book, so it grounds the research, also in the context of Brussels and Toronto, and it states the key research questions. Chapter 2 goes into an overview, so to say a global overview of the urban food movements nowadays, the key problematic food system problems that ushered urban food movements to arise, and the key ideologies and transformative values that food movements put forward nowadays, very briefly. And chapter 3 and the subsequent chapters 4 to 6 go into this hybrid governance concept, as well as how hybrid governance and its tensions manifest in different case studies in a comparison between Toronto and Brussels. And the chapter 7, of course, is the epilogue in which I reflect a bit on how this concept of hybrid governance and its tensions is even more urgent, or can be applied to the contemporary situation of crisis and socio-ecological emergencies that characterize our time and society today. So in my presentation now, I will briefly go through mainly these chapters, the theoretical framework and different food movement initiatives in Toronto in particular. So leaving a bit aside Brussels for the moment. So the hybrid governance concept, very briefly. So hybrid governance is informed by theoretical tradition on social innovation and collective action. Social innovation, collective action helps to understand how actors mobilize themselves and build organizational networks. These networks and actors are often driven by transformative values and ideologies, but also by very pragmatic and material needs, such as the need to access land, to access good and nutritious food, etc. So it helps to understand how organizations form and evolve through time. Literatures on the politics of land and resource access help, to conceptualize how food movement face challenges such as the scarcity of available and accessible land and resources. So negotiating fair access to land and material resources, and clashes among values and visions on land access. And institutional aspects or governance and transition help to understand how urban food movement goes through different institutional barriers, such as barriers related to institutional constraint on land access or on whatever program or project food movement want to implement. And the search for empowerment, leadership, and institutional support. So the joint connection or reading of these three bodies of knowledge helped me to come up with three types of governance tensions. The first type of tensions can be called the land resource governance tensions, so power dynamic related to the access, control, and use of land and material resources. Organizational governance tensions, a second type, tensions in developing sustainable and resilient food movement organizations. And a third type of tension, institutional governance tensions, so struggle to develop empowering and supportive institutions for the urban food governance. So the key questions are how do urban food movements go through, experience these tensions? And what do urban food movements learn by the very process of going through the different tensions? So there is also a reflexivity and learning aspect that is a further thread of this research and book. So now let's see how these tensions apply a bit to different initiatives in Toronto. So starting from land rights and governance tensions. So one of the initiatives that I explored in the analysis of land rights and governance tensions and how food movement try to deal with them is the Seed Gardens or Community Engagement and Entrepreneurial Development Gardens project. So you know it, many of you know it well. It's a project aimed at enhancing access to land, food security, and community development in a low-income area of Toronto. It can be considered a pilot urban agriculture project because its ambition is transformative, is like to make more projects like that possible. No? So to state this with the word of one of the engaged actors, which is also present in this room, we want to try to establish these agreements that would be enable more kind of urban farms to happen, not only for growing, but also for selling. So this is a bit like the ambition to steer some transformative process. Yet, in a several years long process, only 2 farms sites of the 5 that were conceived are implemented. No? And one of the key factors and key reasons of that is really the need and the struggle to cope with different constraints on the access to land. So here to show the location more or less of these of this project and the ownership of the state actor. So the hydro corridor seems to be the most suitable space, being a long strip of green area that is not utilized. Yet, conflict on land access come up. We have got every single barrier, including community members who organize against. Being able to move an entire institution, getting people to think differently about the possible use of space is very challenging. So conflict related to what is a common, also whether using public land for selling purposes means privatizing or not implementing a proper or common or shared use of land. Conflict about soil safety procedures and the provision of necessary infrastructure and financial resources, and also issues of embedding the project within the communities, and also conflict also in this sense, which provoke delays and communication challenges and an uncooperative overall institutional structure. So one thing that we learn and that also actors active in this project learn out of the process is the role of community organizations and engaged people within these community organizations, so program managers, members of community organizations, community leaders, etc., in sensitizing and in moving things forward. So these community organizations are a real resource for the food movement, acting through conflict management and mediation and communication. And the fact that mediating between different uses of space and different values attached to land is still a persistent struggle that implies balancing utopic and transformative objectives with a pragmatic and context-sensitive approaches. I leave it here for further discussion, but now let's go through organizational governance tensions. So some of them will recognize this picture, especially Marie-Lou Morgan present here in the room, as well as Debbie Field. So the origins of Toronto Food Share and in general, and the Good Food Box in particular, are readable also in this sentence from a very famous document from the City of Toronto in 1985. Councillor Anne Johnston and Mayor Art Eggleton stressed the urgent need to become catalysts in the creation of food co-ops by providing vehicles for transportation and food orders from the terminal market to co-op distribution sites. So this a bit describes the genesis of this type of organization in a context of poverty and socioeconomic distress in the 1980s, which triggered organizational governance tensions visible in the genesis and emergence of grassroots food movement organizations and networks seeking alternative approaches to dealing with hunger. And one of the key factors of tensions characterizing food sharing in its trajectory and the Good Food Box within it is this will to foster alternative values of community food security as opposed to charitable food distribution. And the will to foster a subsidized public food system as one of the strong threads in the value system of this food organization. But also the organizational governance tension, so to say, of an organization such as Food Share and the Good Food Box through time are also readable in the day-to-day management of this organization. So here, a very emblematic sentence: not a single box could go out without hundreds of partnerships. Each stop as a community coordinator, a volunteer, in a neighborhood or an agency staff member. So like partnership making suing and building relations with different actors, donors, or actors from the Toronto Food Terminal, etc., is also part of the day-to-day governance struggle or governance, actions of this food organization that I also tried a bit to represent and convey in the book. Up to the recent stage of food share and the Good Food Box, where new sources of tension and reflexivity arise, these new sources of tension and reflexivity are reflected or represented in different factors. First, a shift in leadership and a stronger reassessment of key values and organizational principles of the organization Food Share. So a reinforced commitment to tackle anti-Black racism as part of the work to address food insecurity, which is readable, of course, also in the Food Share recent strategic plan, rooted in food justice. And also responding to a situation of emergency, a new situation of crisis and emergency in which communities go back and Food Share, Good Food Box aim to respond. So a Good Food Box in emergency times, a Good Food Box that goes back a bit in a charitable distribution model during this period, putting aside, at least temporary, some of the core organizational pillars of the organization to show the work of a Good Food Box manager. It is something that Food Share never did. Technically, we are a charity, but we have never been an organization that gives food for free, because we need to be able to change the system. So that was a huge shift in how we operate. So what we learn a bit by this very synthetic overview is the importance for an organization like Food Share, but representative of other organizations of food movement. It's the importance of safeguarding unquestionable values and organizational pillars, but also having a certain flexibility and capacity to reframe and readapt some of the key principles through time. So to use the word of the big field, if we build an organization with strong commitment to principles and flexibility in terms of programming and changing, you can survive a very long time. So there is a bit of a lesson or a message about how to build resilience in an organization. So capacity of organizational leadership and being ahead of time, but also awareness about a condition in which an organization like Food Share needs, in a way, to be prepared to cope with constant tensions in the sense of precarious access to resources, need to for constant, connection with the donor funding programs, etc., and making, the programs sustainable. And an overarching, if you want, tensions which is at the core of an organization like Food Share, between responding to immediate food security needs and a persistent battle for a public food system, which is also informed by values of food justice. Let's now go through the institutional side of governance tensions, which are very connected to the other kind of tensions, of course. So to illustrate institutional types of governance tensions, in this sense, tensions become key lenses to read in key stages in the food movement of Toronto, from the genesis of the contemporary urban food movement up to the recent stage. So emerging governance tensions are, in a way, triggers of reflexivity and socio-institutional change throughout the trajectory. From the first stage, so the early days of the Toronto food movement in the 1980s up to 1990s, where situations of socioeconomic crisis, as I anticipated, generated severe organizational and institutional governance tensions. So the escalation of charitable and emergency responses to hunger and food insecurity, generating also proactive responses of key personality figures and national food movement organizations. So progressive city mayors or councillors, such as we see in this document of Mayor Eglinton, that can be considered a first policy document of the Toronto food movement, food policy document. The emergence of what I would define as bottom-linked institutions, so institutions that connect top-down forces with bottom-up actor and organizations, such as the Toronto Food Policy Council, which shows quite, since the beginning, quite a proactive attitude in searching for allies in different sectors of the food system, but also quite some struggle since the beginning in building its legitimacy as a food movement organization and institution. So, to quote the words of the first Toronto Food Policy Council coordinator, we knew right away that we had to work on two levels: long-term policy change, but we also needed to some short-term project, because the short-term victories would help us to establish our credentials, why we needed to exist. So this tells like also the struggle to build this credibility of an institution like the Food Policy Council. Another key stage in the trajectory of the Toronto food movement, of course, is the amalgamation of the late 1990s, early 2000s. Toronto, that from the old city of Toronto, expands, englobing the crowning municipalities towards the amalgamated Toronto. So that, of course, as you know, and many of you know, the Toronto amalgamation brought structural changes and a different cultural and political landscape, and had a huge impact in the ways in which the Toronto Food Policy Council operated. So reduced budgets and support, and a different kind of relationship with the city, to quote the first coordinator. So all of a sudden, the governance tensions emerge, as a threat in a way. So the need to cope with an hostile political and institutional environment, and the need to fight for legitimacy and existence, but also as opportunities, opportunities to build new leadership structures with Wayne Roberts, to which the book is dedicated. I want to whom one of the people to whom the book is dedicated with honor, and to build new alliances and coalitions, such as the Food and Hunger Action Committee and Environmental Task Force. That to quote the word of Wayne Roberts, the Food Charter, which emerged out of this process, gives to the Toronto Food Policy Council a new space of action, a new field of action. So the role of the Food Policy Council is to help to the city to implement the Food Charter. So also opportunities emerge out of these phases, and elements of reflexivity, which consist of repositioning, trying to reposition an institution like the Food Policy Council as a legitimate food policy organization, and the proactive will to scale out food system principles and practices across administrative and policy structure. And this is the basis of the later process, now the Toronto Food Strategy, which is a sort of legacy of this first reflexivity phase. So the Toronto Food Strategy brings a further amplified intention to foster a food system lens. Our job of food policy people is to branch across the whole city corporation, and to see how we can influence the way in which city departments are doing their work. Up to the current stage, which in terms of governance tensions is very, give a lot of flesh to the analysis, because in this period, a plurality of threatening tensions come up, top-down institutional dynamics again emerging, a new governmental coalition from the provincial level announcing budget cuts and scarce institutional support by some state institutions, the advent of the COVID-19 and the food justice critique that comes up with a greater strength. So a plurality of threatening tensions that bring a new situation of reflexivity, so to say, so a new situation of tensions in which institutions like the Toronto Food Policy Council need to fight for its existence or need to radically reinvent its existence. And here the word of one of the previous coordinators of the Food Policy Council. So a reshuffled institutional basis, also a new framing for the Toronto food strategy, changing a bit its positionality and its institutional framing within, social development, finance, and administration, and so with a different setting and also different, perceptions from the actors involved on how the strategies can continue its food system and push food system work. So whatever the direction will be, a future food policy council and food strategies will have to rebuild its positioning and its legitimacy as an institution that represents the diversity of the Toronto urban food community and citizenry. So what we learn from this whole synthetic reconstruction is, first of all, the role of crisis and disruptive time as threats, but also as opportunity, as we see. So, but also the role of history and incremental work in building a bit of bottom-linked and cooperative institutional structures. We also see how legitimacy and safe institutional space is not guaranteed. It's not something guaranteed, but there is always a need for reframing and reinventing through time a bit the role of some key institutional structure of the food movement, as well as the role of social justice in itself as a source of conflict that comes up clearly in the recent phase, and a structural issue to take fully into account. Some concluding remarks. This book aims to be an intellectual contribution to the urban governance debate and to give voice to on-the-ground actors, organizations, and institutions of the food movement. It also aims to raise a bit of awareness and reflexivity about key tensions food movement experience, and it also wants to convey the message that government tensions are barriers, but also vehicles for productive ways forward. So, for the building of bottom links or cooperative agreements and arrangements and ways forward. So, for sure, there are potentials to develop the public governance framework, for instance, through a more in-depth analysis of the role of crisis, including contemporary socio-ecological emergencies, with respect to public governance and also the multidimensional need for justice that this implies. Thank you for your attention, and I'll open to discussion.
So, Sandra, do you want to join the panelists? We'll move to part 2 here, where before we open to the general Q&A, we're going to have the panel I mentioned at the start. I hope everyone's hearing me okay. So we're going to turn off the sharing, and so Alessandra is going to ask each of our panelists one question individually, and then just a general one, 2 or 3 for any reactions before then we open it up to the Q&A. However, I'm sure there are already some burning questions for Alessandra based on her presentation. So for those in the room, we have index cards that we will, Aya will hand you if you have any questions. And for those out there, please use the chat feature, and you can start sending them in the next half hour or so until we open it up. So I'll pass it on to Alessandra. I guess Debbie will be right back.
Mm.
Yeah, thank you.
Alessandra, maybe we should just take a moment to test to make sure that the microphone
Yeah.
is working along here, so,
Yes,
Can someone out there
well, I
give us a
think,
heads up?
James can text us if he
if
can't hear, because we can move the microphones around, yeah.
can hear.
Just to make sure before we start this part.
Yes, yeah, so this would be the rehearsal. So if,
Can
yes,
someone
someone
confirm?
confirm that you hear online.
I'm hearing perfect, so.
Okay,
Great.
good, thanks. Yeah, so this moment, this session was also aimed to have a bit of feedback and dialogue with people involved in the practice, so with real, like, on the ground agents in the urban food movement, and which also are related to the different initiatives that I investigated. So I would start with Rhonda Peterstein, and based on her involvement on the whole seed gardens process, and also being part of the Toronto Urban Growers organization, so very representative of the issues of land and land resource intentions. A bit of feedback on the analysis and what you would add or what you would comment on this analysis of land resource covenant tension.
Okay, thank you, Alessandra. And I should also acknowledge my other two co-coordinators. So, of course, Joe Nasser, and joining us online is James Coons. And I want to say that as I was reading through your chapters, Alessandra, I was thinking not just of the seed gardens, but also how relevant it is to urban agriculture in general. And, three things stood out for me. There's a lot to comment on, but three things I want to talk about today. So scale, institutionalization of urban agriculture, and the private-public dichotomy, we'll call that for now. So one of the things that really struck me through the seed process of working with community organizations and city staff and Hydro One was just the differences in understanding that came from the differences of scale that they were operating on. And one example of this would be like the costs. The costs of doing the soil assessments and setting up all of the tests and so on for Hydro One, and I think for the city even, those costs were normal for what they would do. For the organizations that were involved, these were huge costs, and to try and get that kind of funding was quite a challenge. And some of the delays that happened were also, again, normal when you're doing a development project, but for community organizations working with funders, that was quite a challenge. So, the understanding needed to go back and forth. The city was working in a particular context, and community organizations had a context, and there wasn't necessarily the understanding. And the way I like to think of it, so particularly during the pandemic, I think we all kind of understood that having a group of people all living in a small space, how fraught that can be. So think about how fraught living together in a city of 3 million, almost 3 million, can be. And it's the city's responsibility to make sure that people are basically getting along. So that helped me to understand where some of the policy discrepancies came from. And Alessandra, I think you kind of acknowledged this a little bit when you're saying that city is an institution and the grassroots groups are perhaps less institutional, but still to some degree. And it really depends on where you stand. Because if you're a community resident, even a grassroots organization can feel very institutional in terms of kind of rigid structures and policies. So just getting that spectrum. One of the Malvern residents mentioned that it was there was a little bit of fear in the city about creating a precedent. And this is, to me, a way of reframing it is, you know, I also saw this, there was a resistance to institutionalizing urban agriculture. Sorry, my timer's going off here. There we go, I've already talked more than 3 minutes. Resistance to institutionalizing urban agriculture, because when you make such a large change in terms of creating policies for something, whether it be swimming, whether it be urban agriculture, it's a lot harder to dial it back if you start to see problems, and I think city staff were very aware of that. So I think a really interesting question is, how do the institutions and how do the community folks conceptualize risk? And maybe we'll have time to talk about that later. I won't go into it in great depth, but because of that sense of risk from the city side, it's kind of well known that if you want to get a new program going, start it off as a pilot, because you're not institutionalizing it. You're not setting up a bunch of processes that will be hard to take back. But from the community side, setting up pilots is actually a really vulnerable way to do it, because for one thing, it's easier to terminate a pilot project. You put a lot of work into creating it, someone can pull the plug. But also, we know that the impact that we would like to achieve across the city is very limited with just a pilot. So those are kind of the two contrary risks. I want to say also, one thing I try to get across to people when we talk about access to land is that we're not just talking about land in a conceptual, like a conventional sense. It's also about space to grow. So we're looking at rooftops and small spaces and and greenhouses and things like that. So you know, the farther you go from the accepted practice of like community gardens and allotments that have been around for a long time, the more challenging it is to get permission. So if you're setting up a greenhouse in your backyard, many city staff will not know how to handle you. They don't know what box to put you in. So the more you're moving away from stuff that's already been institutionalizing, the harder it is to gain permission. Next question is, you know, well, why institutionalize urban agriculture? Why not just go ahead and do it? Ask for forgiveness, not permission. And this is where the food justice thing comes in. And, you know, I think the green roof bylaw is a really good example of this, is that food in the initial conceptualization of it wasn't permitted. It's not explicitly allowed. And so that created all kinds of difficulties for people, because they would go to get permission, and depending on who they went to, some city staff would support it and say, yes, you can get funding, and others would say, no, you're not allowed to do that. And it tends to be the people who have more resources and more of the social capital and so on, who can then get their projects to move forward, and other folks who spend a lot of time to try and make it happen, who then don't get to see it realized. And this is the same thing too when it comes to like really tenuous land tenure. So if you're not given access to the land for a long chunk of time, for someone who has resources, there's a little bit more capacity for resilience. But if you are someone who is low income or marginalized, and you want to take that risk, you're investing a lot of resources. If either because there's crop failure or because someone withdraws the agreement for land, then the impact on you is going to be much more severe. So you need to keep that in mind when it comes down to, like, let's create a clear path for people to be able to do urban agriculture, where it is institutionalized. There are the processes there for people to follow. The other thing I think to think about is institutionalizing may be great as long as it doesn't happen in a negative way. So Vancouver is a really good example of a city that's been put up on a pillar as like the epitome of cities that's supporting urban agriculture. But, you know, if you read now about urban farmers are actually moving out of the city of Vancouver, because the way that they institutionalized urban agriculture actually was not favorable for the farmers. And all the policies made it actually difficult for farmers to operate. A more local example would be Parks, Forestry and Recreation is recognized as the division in the city that has the knowledge, the expertise to manage urban agriculture. So anytime you go to any of the other divisions in the city, what they'll do is they'll say, oh, Parks handles that, go talk to Parks. Fine, except for the fact that Parks will not allow sales of food from city land. It's the whole private-public thing. And that's an issue when you're doing urban agriculture, because there are many contexts in which you do want to be able to sell the food. So shifting all of city land, city approvals for urban agriculture to PF&R has an impact on that. And so that's where I kind of want to end up with, is this public-private conception, because in the process of doing the seed gardens, that was one of the explicit reasons for doing the pilot project, was to establish that it was okay to sell food from city land, particularly in the context of community organizations doing community economic development. And it's still a battle. It's still not accepted as a concept. And I think it's partly because there's this binary conception, public over here, private over here. There's a world in between. When we want to create space for social enterprises, for community economic development, and I would say even a better understanding of what it means to have the commons and how people use that. So, and right now there's just, and Debbie, I think with your work on good food markets and so on, I think you've probably seen some of those contradictions of what's allowed in a park, for instance, and what is not. So these are things that we've been chewing on. So I'd be very interested to hear what other folks are thinking on that.
Things to reflect upon. Also very interesting is the issues of institutionalization, and not an only way of institutionalizing, of course, part of this institutionalization that can be negotiated in sectors, and also the issues of common, what we mean by common, and I still stick with this binary logic. Not understand arrangements, etc. So yeah, and thanks for your comment, very valuable. And we go in we follow the sequence of the tensions. So I would ask a bit the same thing, to give a commentary to Debbie Field, with respect to food share, the good food box, but also food share in general, if you feel. So, yeah, give your commentary in whatever way you like.
Sure. I find that hybrid governance and governance tensions together are what is the great insight of your book, and not to focus only on the governance tensions, but the hybrid governance. Mm-hmm. So what I think is really great in the food share story, and it's a long story that started before I was there and continued after I left, and Paul Taylor's just leaving, so there'll be a new executive director soon. And I actually believe that food share, as I said in that quote, will continue on this very clear pathway of some themes that are there from the very beginning. And one of the things that's always fun to do, and Alessandra had it in one of her presentations, so you can Google, if you Google Food Share Toronto founding document, City of Toronto 1985, you'll get that you have the picture of there. And it's a really great document, and one that I go back to, and I've gone back to many, many times over the decades, because within that document were all of these governance tensions and hybrid governance. So the document starts with saying that to ensure people have adequate supply of food, there should be higher welfare rates and higher minimum wage. But then down below, and there are all these different proposals, there is the one, again, that you saw in the presentation, which the city should go and get trucks and go to the Ontario Food Terminal and set up co-op markets. And, you know, Mary Lou and I thought that we had invented the good food markets and the good food box, and didn't read those words until much later. But in fact, in those first documents, they were there. And so if you think about the tension around income security, and yet at the same time, so going to government, demanding adequate income, as we are going through, I mean, we're going through another time like that right now, as we did, you know, in the eighties and many other times when there is, you know, high inflation, potentially recession and potentially high unemployment, and we see this increased use of food banks again, and the need for basic income and guaranteed annual income. At the same time, I believe that we need experimentation in the community sector to provide solutions that can work while we are doing that advocacy. And that's the governance tension or the hybrid governance in food share that was there from the very beginning and continues to be there. And so then you actually have flexibility in terms of even something like the Good Food Box going to be more of a charitable distribution. I mean, so what's incredible is the way in which, because of, again, Mary Lou's great, setting it up the right way, so the Good Food Box and the system where a buyer could get food, any amount of food from the Ontario Food Terminal, then you could put on any amount of more trucks or hire, as they did, you know, hundreds of more staff, and worked actually 3 shifts. You know, they actually packed Good Food Boxes in the night and the afternoon, so that you could scale up or scale down in a very efficient way. And always, the governance tension between the needs of low-income people in the city and farmers. So in Mary Lou's time, it was very much about paying adequately and making sure that we did not ever ask for a donation from a farmer, but that we always paid fairly. And then in the time of the food justice lens, really asking tough questions about migrant workers, which we never asked, which we knew we should have been asking, but we just didn't have the framework or the capacity to think about it, right? We knew that the farmers, even the organic farmers that we were buying food from, were not adequately dealing with migrant workers issues. And so that ability to look at those governance tensions in a continuous way, and to look at the need for experimentation, as you did. I really liked your last slide, which was, you know, how do we make sure that we keep creating solutions, you know, as everything crumbles around us, and, you know, what will be the relationship between government and community-based organizations 10 years from now, 50 years from now, 100 years from now, none of us know. And so again, looking at those founding documents, looking at, again, the relationship with the city always, right? So the founding documents were city documents, and then, you know, the first funding for Mary Lou's salary and Ursula Litsky's, was a small amount of money to get consultants to write a report, come from the Toronto Food Policy Council, right? So the Toronto Food Policy Council, Rod McRae had a small little grant that he could put out for solutions that would twin the governance crisis or the governance tension between farmers who were having trouble selling their product and low-income people who were having trouble accessing the product. So that was the genesis of the city going to a community-based group to look for a solution, and the creation of the Good Food Box. And then, in a very bizarre set of coincidences, when we needed a warehouse, you know, I wrote a letter to the city, do you have a warehouse with a loading dock and refrigerator capacity? And they wrote back and said, yes, we have a building, it's 200 Eastern Avenue, but you'll never be able to use it. Part of this tension between the province and the city. And in that, the City of Toronto entered into a management agreement with Food Share to operate the Good Food Box, so that they could say it was a city-run project. So again, trust in governance tensions between cities and community-based organizations. You know, we have lots of examples of that globally. You know, in Brazil, we have tons of examples of that. So I think your framework is useful. It helps us see both governance tensions, but I think hybrid.
Thanks a lot. Thanks also for underlining the need for continuous experimentation, solutions. Also, Rhonda mentioned this of piloting that can be, on the one hand, implementing, keep on implementing. On the other hand, we need to make sure that only something the most and disappears, no, and a source of learning also for actors to learn how to support things. Implementation phase. Yeah. So now we go through the institutional side.
Can I just jump in to remind people for questions to pass to me so I can start?
With put more than one on one card, or one per card? One per card, or can we put more than one?
You can put more, I would moderate and collate or combine.
Thank you.
So far, not too many questions, so I remind also those online to, add to the chat, in the coming minutes. Lori?
Yeah, for Lori, yeah, the same,
The approach. Well, first of all, congratulations on the book. I think that the concept of hybrid governance is a very useful one. It's also really lovely to see people from across the country on the, online version of this. So there's obviously interest in this concept of hybrid governance in lots of places because it's what we're all dealing with. It's kind of the messiness and the reality of life, in fact. And I think it's a very useful model for thinking about a bottom-linked organization, for thinking about the TFPC. But being a hybrid, having a hybrid governance model has been both an advantage and a disadvantage over the 30-year history of the TFPC. I mean, even the fact that the TFPC was actually part of public health was an odd kind of hybrid decision, because it really, food needed to be a citywide issue. The Food Policy Council was always trying to make it a citywide issue, but for funding reasons and because of people who were the champions of it, this was the place where we could actually launch something. So right from the beginning, it had to be a hybrid of many different ways of thinking about it. Also, I think at the beginning, the word policy had a very different meaning, and it really referred to a comprehensive government alternative to the charitable model of food banks that we had seen with the deindustrialization of the 1980s here. But 30 years later, with 30 years of neoliberalism and government austerity, the TFPC has had to evolve and adapt, and in many ways, policy has not been what has been its strength. Its strength has been initiating different kinds of pilots, in fact, and working with community members to give them a place to come together and think about some of these issues. I think the TFPC was, food insecurity was very much the driver for the creation of the TFPC coming out of deindustrialization. I think that's deepened greatly with a deeper understanding of the concept of food justice. I think that's something that the TFPC was on the verge of taking up when COVID hit, and I think now we're seeing that being handed off to other organizations within the city, such as the Confronting Anti-Black Racism Office, with the Black Food Strategy, the Black Food Sovereignty Strategy, so some very exciting things happening there. Another of the things that the TFPC was able to do was to get the food charter passed unanimously, which was no small thing to have a food charter passed in 2001 by all city councillors. And there's a movement now that that charter needs to reflect the food justice issues that have come to the fore, issues of BIPOC people more overtly, and there's talk about, and the city, in fact, I believe, the Board of Health put a motion forward that we needed to revisit the charter and update it for a new time and a new age. So I think food justice is going to continue to be a big issue in this hybrid governance, however, whatever form it takes now in the city, because we don't really know what's going to happen with the FPC. The food strategy team was dismantled and people were redeployed because of COVID. And but I also think the other big issue that we haven't dealt with on a citywide region yet is climate change. And the food lens move, that when we got a food lens passed through the city, that we should put a food lens on every division, that became a really important piece of work that was just getting started. Literally, the meeting that was really starting to work on that with the waste department as the first example was the day before the lockdown started. So that's been put aside, and we've never really had a chance to go back to that. So that's a really important thing. But to get back to the struggles around hybrid governance, I think there are a couple of ways that this really shows in the TFPC. First of all, the council was made up of residents, citizens with a specific expertise. So they were not coming to the council as stakeholders. We can see by just looking at the COP27 talks how difficult it is to come to any kind of consensus when everyone's in there as a stakeholder. So here, everyone was coming to the table with the idea that they were bringing their expertise to create a more sustainable food system for the City of Toronto. But that was always a tension. People were from the outside who wanted to join, for example, could never quite understand. They would want to come in to represent a particular area that they worked in. And a lot of people came to that with a very open mind, but it was always a concept that was difficult for people to fully understand, how to be non-stakeholders and still represent the work that you were doing. So that, I think, was a complicated part of the TFPC's role, but I think a really essential one in order for it to be able to achieve consensus within the group on a number of initiatives. It was also not very common at the time, and I think the other big piece was the role of the coordinator. So the role of the coordinator was a unique role within the city bureaucracy that was very much a hybrid. In effect, the person who was in that role had two bosses. They had the council itself, and they also had the medical officer of health, because that was really who their boss was in the civil service hierarchy. And having that kind of role made a lot of people within the civil service, I think, very uncomfortable, because they weren't sure quite what was going to happen at the TFPC, and what it was going to come up with and do. And that was always a struggle. But it was an essential piece, because it was one of the things that gave the residents who were interested in food system change real access to the political machinery. Being an insider, the coordinator could understand how the bureaucracy worked, how change could happen, where there might be openings that were not obvious to people outside of the civil service, and how change could happen. And that information could come back to the council to really be a reflexive and reiterative process of finding ways to move things. And I think that's how things such as the Green Roof Bylaw, which was the first in the world for a major city, and which TMU and this very building has taken advantage of with the Black and Indigenous Garden. I think the Food Charter was a very important part of that. A lot of other initiatives happened. Urban Ag Day, working with TUG and getting that as a permanent feature in the city, to have an Urban Ag Day to really promote urban agriculture. A lot of these things were things that happened because there were people who understood how the system worked, working within the TFPC. So I think that's also how, and because of the waning of policy within the city, I think that's how the dessert tray concept that my late husband Wayne developed really came to be, as a response to the fact that we were always working in hybrid governance structures. So you had to think about, and you had a quote about both short-term and long-term that I think came from Rod McRae, talking about that, we had to be having something to show for what we were doing. But a lot of what we had to show for it was building linkages, was educating, giving people within the community access to information about how the city works. I think that was an important role for the TFPC. I think because the city is so siloed, as most institutions are, very difficult to work in one particular body, the Public Health Department, which has always been a bit of an outsider. And this, I think, was also a struggle for the food strategy team. And the TFPC evolved into a reference group for the food strategy team, as well as having its own projects. And the food strategy team was working to implement a food strategy for the whole city. But to be able to talk to everyone in the city was difficult, coming only from public health and not having a mandate through the mayor's office. Sometimes it was very effective, and sometimes it was difficult. So the food lens was a really big advantage to finally have that pass through council and give legitimacy to the work of working with all the different. You could pick up the phone and talk to someone in another division and say, this is something council's mandated. We want to start working on this with you. What's the best way to do it? That's really important when you're working within a city. I think, for me, we're going to see whatever role food plays, it's starting for the first time, I think, to be recognized, and I think the COP is an example. Whether it's successful or not is another thing, that we cannot address many of the really wicked issues around food justice and around climate change in particular, unless we take a food system approach and unless we acknowledge that food is multifunctional and can play a really important role in solving many of the world's problems, and that we cannot achieve our climate change goals without addressing the food system. So in that sense, it's seeing the demise of the TFPC right now, or we actually don't know what its final form is going to be, but it is now in SDFA. It doesn't have full-time permanent staff any longer in the Social Development Office, doesn't have full-time permanent staff or a budget as small as that budget was any longer. So, but it might still evolve into something that can still play a role in bringing deliberative democracy, citizens talking directly to city councillors in some way. And that's my greatest hope, that it can emerge in a new way that can address these, particularly these two big issues of food justice and
Very inspiring, yeah. So,
Can I jump in?
yeah.
Maybe I'll stand here because I think the camera's there. Just stand here for a moment. So I have a couple of questions, but maybe, not questions, I mean, questions that came here. Alessandra, maybe we'll save that last one if there's time to share, whether it's more forward or looking to make sure that we have enough open discussion at this point. But maybe before I do that, just so that we don't leave the get cut off at the end. So there are a couple of the books here that perhaps we can pass around copies of it for those who didn't see it yet, and they may be available for lending privately. So come and talk to me after. Sorry for those online. And we do have flyers with a discount for a few more days, and I think Alessandra has some of the flyers we will circulate in this room. If anyone would like the flyers with online, just email me afterwards. And so I'd go on to the questions that so far I have two very different, interesting questions. I mean, somewhere from two people, I should say, rather than two questions. The first one, maybe I'll just focus on the first part, because the others kind of build on it. Is the bottom line not to help people have access to healthy food due to, well, did I jump past, sorry. Yeah, sorry, that's not the right one. Is the bottom line not to help people have access to healthy food due to climate change, food shortage, imported food, etc., in such difficult times? So perhaps maybe frame it more broadly. I mean, how much is it about this being particular and certain other particularly difficult times versus the ongoing work over 30 years and then more in terms of the focus, whether energy or the action? I mean, how specific is it to difficult times versus difficult times being 30 years in different ways for different people dealing with food sovereignty, food justice issues, food access issues, and so on? So that's the first question. Anyone wants to jump in on that?
Well, I will start. I will start, and then someone can follow for sure. Yeah, of course. I mean, in periods of crisis, problematic such as unfair access to food or to healthy food and things like that emerge with a greater emphasis, greater strength. Although I think is in the trajectory of looking at the trajectory of organizations like FoodShare or the history of the food movement, you see that actually food insecurity and the struggle to allow for greater access to and fair access to food is a never-ending, I think, problematic, no? That then revives in period of crisis and emergency even more. So a never-ending, I think, problematic that keep also organizations active in dealing with that and in advocating for change. Yes, of course, the current also situation is emblematic, I think, of a confluence of different crises as well, like from the climate change emergency to still the precarious access to food, the issues of food justice, etc. So I think, the contemporary situation emphasizes this problematic even more, being so much, comprehensive of different type of crisis. I don't know if anyone wants to add.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a little bit in the chapter when it starts. I mean, we don't know very much about the Brussels group, right? But the GASAP started, network was instigated by grassroots actors, and in particular by citizens activists, agronomists, and small-scale producers who aim to establish a radically different system of food provision from the mainstream food supply chain. So, if we think right now about what's going on in the world in terms of increased global hunger, the points very much that Lori has raised around climate change and increased disparity and just the food crisis. I mean, the whole idea that the war in Ukraine could create the kind of crisis it did because of the global dependence on an imported crop of wheat. And, like all of us in this side of the movement, all the wheat bellies and all the critique of the, industrial model around food. But, the idea of people being able to eat as the first and foremost priority of any government before money is spent on weapons or any other thing, and that there are local supply chains. So in that way, in a megalomaniac way, a field-to-table, again, words that Mary Lou invented, model of world in which everybody eats from a close proximity to where they live is a solution to, these huge disparities. Everybody eats in a kind of subsidized model in which prices are affordable, and there are a variety of mechanisms that could be achieved. So, yeah, I think it's not just the current crisis, but the whole crisis of the industrial food system and the need to rethink it if we are going to live beyond the current crises.
I would add to that, it's not an either or, and in fact, that whole issue of whether it's an either or was right at the very heart of developing the hybrid governance model that emerged with FoodShare and the TFPC and the City of Toronto. I mean, that's exactly what everyone was trying to get at that time, is that we had to address hunger, immediate hunger, but we also had to think a lot more broadly about the bigger socioeconomic structures that were actually causing the problems and the food system itself. So not something where we of course we cannot, and at the same time, we know food banks are there. They're a reality. We have not been able to get rid of them, but this has always been the goal. So to just continue always, and this was a constant argument, to continue always to say, well, we just need to get food into people's bellies and not put any money into thinking about those broader issues, ultimately is not going to solve the problem. But obviously, the problem is so much bigger. It is a global problem. It's a huge problem of, and I think actually when we're talking about hybrid governance, and I was talking about the role of the TFPC coordinators being this unusual role, I think one difficulty of that hybrid governance from the point of view of people who were on the TFPC members is many of them came from grassroots groups that thought they finally had access to power. And they in fact had a lot less access to power than they thought they had, because they didn't really realize how small the TFPC was and the food strategy was within the whole huge government of the City of Toronto, and how little power and budget we had to do things. So that was a tension as well as part of the hybrid governance.
Sure.
I just want to bring Rhonda and Urban Ag in, because one of the things that must be very distressing for all of us as we see the downtown core get paved is just the loss of land, and thinking now again that we have to get pretty vocal about making sure that some of the remaining land that is available, I don't know if people have seen some of the golf course, plans and, you know, creating them as potentially urban farms. David assures me that you could probably golf and have an urban farm going on in the same physical space. It could be well designed, and, you know, so I mean, this, you know, I mean, I guess, you know, Lori raised a really important issue about the Toronto Food Policy Council as a group of volunteers, and part of being here today and moving forward is thinking about what that looks like, and I do believe that, the Center, for Food Security can play a role as in convening, such, you know, a group of volunteers who could come together and, for example, make that demand. Like how, you know, one of the things we have to do, as we saw from this last municipal election and the last provincial election, is if we don't have grassroots organizations that are putting forward any issues, how will we get some of the issues we want to see from an environmental or food point of view talked about? So.
Well, and in fact, when we're talking hybrid governance, if I may just add, I'm remiss if I don't mention the Center for Studies in Food Security at Ryerson and the role it's played as part of this hybrid governance model right from the beginning in supporting the creation of the TFPC, in being TFPC members who contributed a huge amount, in supporting urban agriculture and through the certificate programs and such. So the more you think about hybrid governance, the more interconnected we all are in a large hybrid governance model.
Rhonda? Yeah, well, I wanted to say an even more immediate, organizing moment around, land access is, of course, Bill 23, which is provincial. Up to now, we've been talking very much on a municipal level, but we can't forget the role of the province in this. And part of the reason why I'm mentioning this is, I got an email, earlier this week from, an organizer in Sustain Ontario saying, we need to get together the folks who are doing housing analysis, the people who are doing farmland preservation, people who are looking at food, because this one bill impacts all of us. And that
Rhonda,
is.
can you tell the people online what Bill 23 is in
Oh, sorry.
60 seconds or less?
60 seconds or less. Let's see if I can get the name right. Is it something ridiculous like build more housing faster? So the gist of it is supposed to be to respond to the housing crisis, but actually what it is reducing, the power of the Greenbelt, reducing the power of the conservation authorities, removing green building standards. The list of things that it involves is really kind of horrific,
And
but.
actually taking land out of the green belt.
Taking land out, theoretically putting it back, but what it's doing is it's, getting all these different movements to start talking to each other and sharing analysis. And that, to me, is very exciting, because I think we've been trying to make connections between climate change and food for a long time, and it's an uphill battle, both at the city level, but also just at the grassroots level. So to see this particular collection of people, and it is mostly grassroots groups who are doing that, but they are interacting, to some degree with provincial representatives too, from other parties. So that's a stay tuned, folks. It's coming up over the next couple of weeks.
Well, we've just had an object lesson here in Ontario with the educational workers, that when people come together, there can be some very powerful things that happen. So this may be another galvanizing point to
Even
protect
across
the
unions.
green belt. Yeah.
But I would also want to say that you know, the moment of crisis, which was back to that original question, and you know, yeah, it's about getting food out. I think there's a lot of things that we saw. We saw bike lanes happening, bike lanes in Toronto, the cafe spaces. But what we also saw were organizations like the African Food Basket, Black Creek Farm, saying, no one else is getting food out to our community, we're doing it. And boy, did they pivot, and they got food out to their community. A new group emerged from this as well called Uplift Kitchen. 2 women, a Black woman and an Indigenous woman, said, this is a need in our community. They started cooking in their kitchen. They started cooking food that they had grown in their community garden. They pulled from their neighbors. And it was about for the community, by the community, as opposed to anything top down. And I think now they're trying to figure out, well, what is our relationship to the rest of these structures? So we'll see. Does this little tiny organization stay as it is? Is it able to expand? Does it shift what it's doing? It'll be interesting.
Thanks. Thanks, Beverly, for your question. Of a totally different order, maybe taking back to the beginning, and specifically to Alessandra, this is from Sarah, I think kind of apologetically saying that it may be more of an academic and theoretical question, but I think it's a crucial one to just step back and can you Sarah is asking that there are multiple other governance models in the literature, collaborative governance, multi-stakeholder governance, etc. Can you elaborate on your definition of hybrid governance, which kind of you didn't put out there anyway, and how is it different from some of these others? Just maybe to flesh that back out.
Yeah, true. True. Yeah, it's true. It's a good point. Of course, there are different governance models, and hybrid governance, especially the bottom-linked idea of that is one of the consequences and expressions of hybrid governance could resemble, for instance, collaborative forms of governance, or cooperative forms of governance. But really, hybrid governance theoretically starts from the idea of really looking into what tensions or what type of interaction and tensions come from the interactions among different forces that are the one represented by the state, the one represented by the community actors, the one represented by the market also as well, market actors, so different type of agents, and the hybridity and the tensions that come across by the encounters of different values and these different forms of governance. So it's really hybrid governance and tensions are two very interrelated concepts, and probably, this is what distinguishes a bit the hybrid governance analysis from other type of collaborative models or ways of conceptualize multi-stakeholder governance models. So the identification of, really the analysis and conceptualization of these interactions and the kind of tensions they create. Yeah.
And I've heard you say a couple of times, in fact, that tension doesn't necessarily imply something negative.
Yeah,
So,
exactly. True.
And how can be constructive tensions or reflection?
Exactly. This is also what I wanted to show out of my analysis the analysis of trajectories. So hybrid governance tensions can be destructive or constructive of new forms of governance and new modalities of operating or bringing these tensions into more sustainable and resilient directions, so to say. So theoretically, yes, this is the idea that I wanted to convey as well.
Alessandra, any last questions from online or in person?
I have a follow-up to that question. Would you say hybrid is always involving government? Is that part of what the hybrid's getting at in terms of the tension, is trying to, wrestle these different sort of institutional with non or less institutional frameworks together, whereas collaboration is maybe a bit less focused on some of those nitty-gritty details that are super important for the durability? I'm just curious.
Yeah. Well, hybrid is not necessarily always involved the state actors or the government, for instance. It's more about the relation. It can also involve communities self-organizing by them, without necessarily confronting directly with government. But anyway, you will always have some sort of relationship with other actors, even communities self-organizing and wanting to build something completely autonomous. I mean, they relate, if you want, in a completely autonomous and opposite way to other actors that may be, for instance, the state actor. So the relationality that is involved in hybrid governance, is what hybrid governance wants to convey, so to say, and it's not necessarily like it's not that necessarily the state actor has to be present. But anyway, I mean, we see with the Toronto Food Policy Council and other examples of hybrid institutions, etc., that somehow like state actors are important players, you know, as well in sustaining the food movement and in you know, in different facets, like as in sustaining, but also in constraining the food movement and the food movement initiatives. So somehow, this would open a reflection on the role of state, but yes, of course, state institutions are also important players in different ways.
So it's almost like the hybridity focuses on the fact that all parties involved are undergoing transformation as a result of interacting with each other, or at least that's how I'm understanding it. It's almost like the difference between interdisciplinary scholarship versus transdisciplinary scholarship, the idea that, you know, splitting hairs maybe, but you know, inter is, we come from different perspectives and we bring it all together and we work together, whereas trans and perhaps this idea of hybridity is that it actually transforms everyone's practice as a result of this interaction. Is that a fair?
This is also, it's a good metaphor or interpretation. There is this idea of course, of transformation, of learning as well out of these interactions. True.
Sarah, maybe to partially answer your question about government and governance, the Food Policy Council are projects are just as here we have a bit of a temporary crisis. Many of them are not government-based anyway. This happens to be a public basis. Food Policy Council, I think, I would say most are not, but I think many are not in any case. So there are many different models of Food Policy Councils, and the Food Policy Councils are forms of governance of the government within that area.
So Joe, if I could make one comment from the seed programs and from the Toronto Agriculture Program, I think was a really good example of an interdisciplinary table that brought together many division heads to work on urban agriculture. But it was very unusual in that there were also 4 representatives from civil society. And when we were taking a look at where does TAP go next and what format does it take, we were discussing with folks the idea of does it make sense to have civil society there? And many of the city representatives said, nope. We work differently if there are not community members there, and others really understood the value of having civil society actors there. So I find that really interesting as a dynamic.
Also, sometimes the reasons for the hybrid relationships are very practical ones, like funding. I know of those 400 or so food policy councils around the world, the ones that are not affiliated with any kind of government and don't have any kind of funding coming through that stream are constantly struggling, like every other NGO, and in competition with all the other NGOs that are working on food issues. So that was something that the TFPC could be a kind of body that could bring people together, because it was not in competition for funding with everyone else. And that was really critical. So I think that that's one of the things we have to think about when we're thinking about hybrid governance models is, how are you actually going to pay for this? Because volunteers cannot do it. It's just not possible, especially, you know, it gets more and more crazy all the time in everyone's life. But you can't ask people to, they can come to meetings, they can give ideas, They can, pick up certain people are going to pick up certain projects, but often that's the most they can do. They can't write reports, they might be able to visit a city councillor, but they really don't have the capacity and the time lives. So you need someone who's working for the city, who's actually there representing them, who can help to coordinate.
Just note, maybe, just pass it back to Alessandra for her final question with
Sure.
one minute answers from
Yeah,
our panel.
yeah, it's a bit a forward-looking question, and partially was answered under the line of your interventions, but what would you see as a future, if you want, development of hybrid governance and its tensions based on the history and the past and the present and your involvement into different initiatives in the Toronto Food Movement? What would you suggest as keywords or possible way forward for the future of the movement? Yeah. Who wants to start?
I can start.
Yeah.
So one of the things that's really come out of the COVID pandemic for me, and perhaps for a lot of people present, is just how much focus there is now on food justice. I mean, it's always been an issue, but I'm finding that we are having to think and listen and engage and change the way we're doing things far more than we ever had to before. And you would have to talk to people in the Black and Indigenous communities about whether they feel that the same motion is happening, but as a white settler, I am definitely feeling that there is that change. And there are two things that I think are relevant to the issues you raised, Alessandra, about building relationships between government and other actors, is we need to cultivate a culture of listening. Like, it sounds so basic, but I think there's so many barriers to actually listening to each other, particularly given that all of our experiences are very different. So how, in a very practical way, do we make that happening? And of course, the relationship of ourselves to the land and to each other. I'm also hearing a lot of very interesting conversations coming out of Black and Indigenous communities about how to change that, because I think we need to make a profound change. We are not going to address climate change. We're not going to address war around the world. We're not going to address hunger or poverty unless we have these stronger relationships with each other. We're just going to keep tumbling over each other all the time. We're going to set up more barriers than we take down. So I think that is one of the most critical issues that we need to work on. On a slightly smaller scale, I'd love us to engage a little bit more on that relationship building piece of, Alessandra, you talk about cultivating leadership within the city, working on that. One of the challenges of that is Toronto, in particular, is a very mobile city. People come and go. You cultivate a champion, they do wonderful work, and then they move on. And then what? So how do we work in that environment? How do we keep building those relationships of trust when people are moving around? Big scale, small scale.
Sure. For me, thinking very specifically about the TFPC, I look to the Indigenous Advisory Council City, which is a council that answers directly. It provides advice to City Council directly, whereas the TFPC used to go through Public Health and the Board of Health, which then would bring initiatives to the city. I think we need to rethink how we create membership, who is going to be at the table. There's a lot of discussion to be had about that. I think my one fear is that being now located in the Social Development Office, Social Development Division, that we could be relegating food to poverty reduction. And obviously food insecurity is a huge part of the issue, but there is so much more food can do. It's so much more powerful. And poverty reduction is complex in itself and has a whole lot of other issues connected to it that I think food can start to address. So I hope that it is permitted to, and this is that old debate, are we feeding people who are hungry, or what is it that we're trying to do? I think we have to bring it, that food lens to the whole city, and I hope that there will be some way for that to happen in the
Well, I think building on Rhonda's point about listening and also the new partnerships, I do think that we can work in some kind of alliance with leaders of both the Indigenous and Black community, Black farmers, and to create this new alliance that is us listening, but us also figuring out a space where we can have, you know.
Well,
Yeah.
thanks. I think that we're just about on time, perfectly on time. We don't, on a very long day. So I want to thank everyone here. So I guess our first hybrid seminar, in who knows when. And I want to thank particularly, like, being complex operation to put this together, and thank particular to June, to Aya, Brian, Rhonda, James, and a larger group who helped put this together, and of course for Alessandra. And I should say, Alessandra ran the New York City Marathon, finished it, and then she's standing here with us to people. Thanks for everyone online.
One of the hardest things I've done.
We have, and I should say, we're hoping that this can be, this is the second non-hybrid, but second fully online webinar that we had. The previous one was also complex because there were panelists here and in Japan, and time difference and everything, and James and Rhonda and everyone else made it happen. And so we're hoping to have more. So look, and to hopefully put the recordings online soon. And so stay tuned to the same lists and so on for when those go up. And yeah, probably there might be, I hear rumors of maybe one more this year, seminar, but otherwise definitely in the winter semester. Did I miss anything? And thanks, of course, to our wonderful panel here and their conversation with Alessandra and their acceptance to talk of hybrid hats that they brought here to the table as actors, researchers, teachers, all in one.
Really, thanks
Thank
a
you.
lot for being here, accepting and giving this feedback. And now I would rewrite the book after.
That book is done, but
Yeah.
thank you.